Chapter 5. That night, after a rather gloomy meal of sardines on toast and mousetrap cheddar, Paul had a strange dream. It was strange because in it he wasn't being chased down long, dark corridors by maths teachers or vulture-headed ants. He didn't find himself doing the reading at morning assembly wearing only a dunce's cap. He wasn't sitting an A-level in classical Sanskrit, and no curly-headed young men in Victorian costume came gate-crashing at the end. Instead, he was sitting in an office which for some reason he knew belonged to J.W.Wells, the senior partner he'd never seen. It was huge, with a high, ornate ceiling and a splendid bay window looking out over the rooftops of the City of London. The desk was a football pitch of shimmering, figured French walnut, and the Persian rug on which it stood would have paid for a small hospital or 5 minutes for Julia Roberts' time on the silver screen. One of the paintings on the wall was an unrecorded Vermeer. Paul wouldn't have been able to tell Vermeer from an optician's chart when he was awake. And the other, a plain canvas with a dab of Prussian blue in one corner and 3 dried baked beans in the other, was less than a year old and worth twice as much. In a glass case beside the door lay a priceless 17th century Pappenheim rapier, a Gutenberg Bible, a candle in a massive 13th century parcel-gilt candlestick, a rather gaudy silver Victorian handbell, and a plain gold ring. Apart from 7 telephones, all different colours, a framed sepia photograph of a man in a top hat and a frock coat, and a bird cage with its door open, the desktop was bare. Paul was sitting in a large Gothic chair, which he had an idea was made of ivory. In his left hand he held a cup of Lapsang tea. Cool, he thought. The dream seemed reluctant to let him in on how he came to be there, but he knew that it was his office now, and had been for some time. The only drawback he could see was that the soles of his shoes had at some point been stapled to the floor, which meant he couldn't move his feet. Across the desk from him was another, much plainer chair, and in it sat a goblin. He knew it was a goblin because there'd been a picture of one in Sophie's fairy tale book, and this one was identical in every respect, apart from the fact that it was wearing a grey silk Italian suit and an inappropriate tie. The goblin was holding a spiral-bound notebook and a pencil and looking at him expectantly. He was, he realised, in the middle of dictating a letter. Right, Paul said. Could you just read that back to me? The goblin nodded and recited in a soft, purring female voice that would have played hell with his libido if it hadn't been filtered through a mouthful of long, yellow teeth. Dear sir, we thank you for your letter of the 17th and note what you say. However, in the circumstances now prevailing, we feel that we cannot agree with your analysis of the situation and must therefore regretfully decline your esteemed offer. We beg to remain, etc. Buggery, Paul thought. What's all that about? Fine, he heard himself say. Get that in tonight's post, would you? First class. The goblin stood up. Paul handed it the teacup and it left the room, silently closing the door behind it. Now there was a computer on the desk. He snapped his fingers. Paul couldn't snap his fingers, and the screen filled with figures. He stared at them for a while, and then reached out with his forefinger and traced down the columns one by one, until a familiar tingling stopped him. He wrote down some numbers on the notepad that hadn't been there a few seconds earlier, and then pressed a buzzer on the side of the desk. The goblin came back. Ask Scuffy to pop up and see me, Paul said. Oh, and would you mind nipping down and seeing if those bauxite scans are ready yet? I need them for Thursday afternoon's meeting, and Rick will need a few days to check them out. Right away, the goblin purred. This time Paul didn't see it go, because he was preoccupied with more figures on the computer screen. He was listening as well as reading, as if they were some kind of musical notation, and the computer was somehow sending the music they'd represented straight through to his brain, without having to bother with passing it through his ears. Then the door opened, and someone came and sat down in the chair. You wanted to see me, Jack, someone said, but he couldn't place the voice, or even tell if it was male or female. Have a look at this, Paul replied, swivelling the VDU round so it faced the other chair. 3rd column, 5th line. What do you make of it? Whoever it was didn't reply. Paul had known in advance that he or she wouldn't. He felt extremely tense, as though knowing the coming interview was going to be awkward and painful. "You know what I think?" he heard himself say. "Well, of course you do. You aren't stupid. We both know what I'm talking about. Mostly I'm just curious to see if you've got anything to say for yourself." "Would it make any difference?" the voice asked. "No," Paul said. "Except I'd really like to know why. It seems such a strange thing to do." "To you, maybe, but not to me." He sighed, because here came the really nasty bit, the part he'd been dreading. Before he could say anything, however, a door materialised in the opposite wall, between the Vermeer and the modern abstract. He watched it form. First, the door frame and lintel appeared as thin grey pencil outlines on the pale silk wallpaper, and then their contours and decorative mouldings were fleshed out with lines of shadow, making them three-dimensional. And then the panels, hinges and round brass handle of the door grew up out of the wall like speeded-up mushrooms. He realised that he was staring and looked away, while keeping the new door under observation through the corner of his eye. It opened, and two very old men in black pinstripes crept in, trying not to make any noise. One of them put his forefinger to his lips and silently mouthed, "Hush." He deliberately didn't look at them as they tiptoed past him and stood behind his chair. "They're here, aren't they?" said the voice from the other chair. "What makes you think that?" "I can feel them hating me, but that's all right. In fact, I'm glad they're here. Say hello to them for me, if you like." "Don't be ridiculous." "Nothing ridiculous about it at all. You know as well as I do. They can't come back home without him, and we're the only ones who know where he is. You," the voice added meaningfully, "and me." He had no idea why, but Paul didn't like that at all. "Are you threatening me?" he said. The voice laughed. "Hardly," it said. "A threat is a promise of unpleasant action that stands some chance of happening. If I threaten you with something that we both know will never happen, it can't be a proper threat. You aren't stupid either," the voice went on, enjoying itself. "You don't want him back any more than I do, and so long as he's away, they can't come through. But that's by the by. It's not a threat, because I'm not going to turn him loose, because you aren't going to do anything that would make me take such an unfortunate step. Do we understand each other?" Paul felt angry and slightly sick, but all he said was, "Yes." "Fine," the voice replied, "in which case I'll cut along and leave you to your bauxite scans. Nice little venture, that. I'm glad you took my advice. What this firm needs is diversification. It's going to make it through the 21st century. The voice faded away until the chair was empty. At once, Paul swung round in his chair, but the two old men and the door they'd come in through weren't there any more. He stood up, and then remembered he couldn't move his feet, and he sat down again. And then he saw something and clicked his tongue in annoyance, a long, ragged claw mark right in the middle of his beautiful polished desktop. He jabbed petulantly at the buzzer, and the goblin appeared. "Get rid of this, will you?" he snapped. The goblin sighed. "Sorry," she said, "but the houses are all gone under the sea. The dancers are all gone under the hill, and the earliest they can manage is Friday. I can cover it up with something in the meanwhile, if you like." Paul shook his head. "No, that's all right," he muttered irritably. "Make sure nobody leaves the building. I'm going out for lunch. That rather nice little Uzbek place round the corner." "I'm sorry," said the goblin sadly, "but I'm afraid you can't. Would you like me to get you a sandwich or something?" Paul tried to drag his left foot off the floor, but he couldn't shift it. "No thanks," he snapped. "I've got a tin of pilchards here somewhere. If only." He sat up. His alarm was warbling spitefully. It was 7:15, Tuesday, and he had to get up and go to work. No more than 6 feet away, the sword in its idiotic stone loomed over him like a drill sergeant. Even the recollection that he'd be seeing Sophie again in an hour and 3/4 didn't do much to cheer him up. And as for the day ahead... Yesterday afternoon, they'd reported to Mr. Tanner's office, as ordered. He'd grinned at them. That presumably explained why Paul's dream had been haunted by goblins, and told them he had a little job he wanted them to do. "Well," he added with a snicker, 2 jobs. First, there was a stack of spreadsheets. They needed photocopying, and then stapling together ready for Friday afternoon's partners' meeting. After they'd done that, they were to go down to the strong room in the basement. It was in an awful mess, he told them. Deeds and securities and documents all out of their files and drawers and boxes and jumbled about, and half the stuff listed and registered didn't seem to be there. Do a stock take, make an inventory, get it all sorted out and filed away neatly. And you better bring along an old tatty pullover or something, because it's a bit dusty and dirty down there, not to mention perishing cold this time of year. Paul had an old tatty pullover, which also happened to be his best, smartest pullover. He thought Mr. Tanner had been exaggerating, but he doubted it. Dust made him sneeze, and the cold gave him headaches. What fun! Yes, he thought, but today I'm going to see the girl I love. And as he dressed and shaved, he wondered what it could possibly be like to see the girl he loved every day of the week, not just Monday to Friday. To see her lying beside him in bed when he woke up, and crunching her breakfast toast, and hanging out underwear to dry on the radiators, and cursing because she was going to be late and she couldn't find her keys. What on earth would that be like, he wondered, and for the life of him he couldn't imagine it. It was more distant and surreal than his dream, or any number of goblin eyes and swords in stones. It belonged to another dimension, a world where things were different, somewhere most people managed to end up, but which he'd never be able to reach. He fished out his pullover from the drawer under the bed and stuffed it in a plastic carrier bag. One explanation for the greatest mystery of all is as follows. 20,000 years ago, before the first walls were built at Jericho, and the ancestors of mankind still lived in hut circles, patiently chipping at flints with stubs of reindeer horn, the photocopier manufacturers and suppliers of office stationery lived at peace with one another, each considering the other's needs and adapting their wares accordingly. But then a great wrong was done by one against the other, so that forever after, from age to age, each strove to thwart the other's designs, and since then, even though the cause of the feud has long since been forgotten, the hatred between them has grown ingrained, past all reconciliation. This deadly quarrel, more bitter even than the wars of the software lords of the Southwest against the Dark Lord of Seattle, accounts for the fact that no standard format spreadsheet will fit in the bed of a standard format office photocopier, and generations of hapless office juniors, secretaries and trainees have had to do the best they can with scissors, Pritt sticks and Scotch tape. Are these the same ones we sorted into piles? Paul speculated, as he nibbled sellotape with his teeth. Or is this a different batch of meaningless drivel? Sophie shrugged her thin shoulders wearily. No idea, she said. Does it matter? No, not really. They'd spent all morning in the photocopier room, and there was still a heart-breakingly thick wodge left in the folder still to do. Bugger, he added. That red light's come on again. Can you remember what we did the last time? That's the paper feed, isn't it? I thought it was the toner. He sighed. You're probably right. My brain switched off about an hour ago. Paul opened the little plastic panel in the side of the machine and poked about with the stub end of a pencil. It had done the job, either the time before last or the time before that, though he had no idea why. All right, he said. Try that. The machine wheezed into action. The brightly green, shining slider thing got halfway through its stroke and froze. It's eating the paper again, Sophie growled. That wasn't good. Once the machine had got its rollers on a sheet of paper, it tended to cling on, like a dog refusing to let go of the stick he'd just retrieved, and its grip was far greater than the tensile strength of 90-gram copy paper. Extracting the tiny pulped slips that stayed behind after a jammed sheet being yanked out by brute force would have taxed the skill and patience of a brain surgeon. There's got to be something you can pull off or unscrew, Paul said, so you can get at the paper feed from the side. Sophie looked at him. Don't you dare unscrew anything, she said grimly. If you start fiddling with it, that'll be it. Harsh words, but fair. Paul knew perfectly well that the elves hadn't blessed him with the knack of taking things to bits and putting them back together again. Even changing the fuse in a plug was a dark and terrible adventure, as far as he was concerned. Well, how about bashing it, he said. I don't think that would help. I suppose not, he sighed. But still. There, she interrupted, holding up a crumpled, blackened, but unshredded sheet of paper. Got it. Bloody hell, how did you manage that? By going at it nice and steady, Sophie replied, with more than a hint of smugness, instead of trying to fight it to the death. She shook her head. Men, she said. "If they can't bash it over the head with a club, they're completely helpless. All right, try it now." Paul riffled the paper and put it back in the feed tray. Then he hit the button. The slider slid back, graunched its gears a couple of times, and froze. 3 red lights that hadn't flashed before started flashing. "Fuck!" Sophie shouted, and she belted the machine's steel flank with her balled fist. The 3 red lights went out, and the slider purred smoothly into its ordained course. The copied page fed smoothly out the other side, still faintly warm. "Don't say anything," Sophie warned him. It sounded like good advice, and he took it. They managed to get a dozen sheets copied before the machine broke down again. This time, however, it was apparent that they were way past the point where a nice and steady or shrewdly placed right cross could do any good. Not only were all the red lights flashing at once, 2 green lights and an amber one they hadn't even known was there were strobing frantically, and the thing was beeping like a small, agonized rodent in a trap. Paul felt the only humane thing to do would be to shoot it. Having trouble? How long Mr. Suslovich had been standing there in the doorway they didn't know. Sophie jumped as though she'd just been stung by a bee. "Temperamental beast," Mr. Suslovich said. "I keep telling the others we ought to upgrade, get a new one, but they won't hear of it. Mind if I take a look?" Paul got smartly out of the way, and Mr. Suslovich knelt down beside the machine, like a vet attending to a sick calf. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just kneeling and listening. His head nodded from time to time, and once or twice he clicked his tongue as if in sympathy. Then he gave the machine a gentle tap, more of a reassuring pat than a thump, and stood up. The beeping stopped and the lights went out. "Try it now," he said. A perfect copy, unwrinkled, unsmudged, oozed smoothly out from between the rollers. "What was the problem?" Paul ventured to ask. Mr. Suslovich shrugged. "Search me," he said. "I don't know the first thing about these gadgets, but it always used to work on an old Datsun I used to have years ago. So I guessed it might be worth a try. Have either of you two seen the long stapler?" Paul nodded. "Actually, we're going to use it for putting these together after we finished copying." "That's all right," Mr. Suslovich said. "I only want it for a moment." Paul nodded. "It's just here," he said, "on the table, next to the—" He frowned. "It was there a minute ago," he said. Mr. Suslovich grinned. "Elusive little tinker, isn't it?" he said. "Not to worry. If I manage to track it down, I will drop it back here after I've finished with it, okay?" After he'd gone, and the machine had churned out a dozen or so faultless copies, Sophie said, "That was just like in the film with Robert Redford." "What film?" "Where he's this man who can talk to horses," she replied. "It was like he was listening to what it was saying." "Robert Redford?" "No, him, Mr. Suslovich. It was like the machine was telling him what was wrong with it. Don't gulp at me like that," she added. "I know it sounds nutty, but that's what it reminded me of." Paul shrugged. "Talking to horses is one thing," he said. "You need to be able to sweet-talk an army mule to get any joy out of this heap of junk. I don't need to listen to it to know what it's thinking. It doesn't like me, simple as that." Whatever it was Mr. Suslovich had done, it seemed to have worked. Apart from one torn page, for old time's sake, Paul assumed, the device polished off the rest of the copying without a hitch. That just left them with the relatively straightforward job of cutting and sticky taping the rest of the copies up together, collating them and stapling them into bundles. "We need that long stapler," Sophie pointed out. Paul nodded. "I'll go and see if I can find it," he said, with all the enthusiasm of Captain Ord's taking a stroll through the permafrost. To his surprise, he didn't have far to look. He decided to make a detour by way of the coffee room, and when he opened the cupboard where the sugar lived, there it was. "How did it get in there?" Sophie asked, when he told her about his mission. "Oh, you know what it's like," he replied. "You put something down in this place, and next minute it's gone, and it doesn't turn up for weeks. Probably a spatio-temporal anomaly or a divergence in the force." "Are people taking stuff and not putting it back when they finish with it?" Sophie said disapprovingly. "Possibly," Paul replied sceptically. "But maybe a trifle far-fetched. Sod, it's out of staples." He refilled it from a box on the shelf. It was a cumbersome thing, ancient and grouchy, with a spring that appeared to have a distinct appetite for human flesh. He handled it warily and got away with nothing worse than a slight graze. "It's 5-1, he observed. "We might as well leave the sorting and stapling until after lunch." It was all in the way he said it, and he hadn't intended for it to come out that way, but there was no mistaking the assumption, namely that they were going to go out of the office and have lunch together, like they'd done the day before. It was another moment. "All right," Sophie said, after a brief hesitation. Simple as that, Paul thought. Maybe that's how it happens, for everybody else. They went, by mutual unspoken agreement, to the same sandwich bar. As they stood in a queue, Paul did a spot of mental arithmetic, figuring out how long it had taken to walk home from the office to Kentish Town for the next week, and said, "What are you having?" "That's all right," she said. "No, but you paid for me yesterday." She looked at him. "You haven't got any money," she said. He ought to have shrunk by 6 inches or so, but he didn't. "True," he admitted. "Well then." He didn't know what to say. That's very... "Yes, coffee and a ham roll, wasn't it?" Paul nodded. Some explanation, he felt, was necessary, or at least some assurance that he wasn't just a fortune-hunting gigolo battening onto her as a source of free carbohydrates and nothing more. But he knew he wasn't capable of putting stuff like that into words without making things a whole lot worse, so for once he did the sensible thing and gave up. "Well, thanks," he said. "That's all right." In a way, he felt as though all his adult life, ever since he'd realised that girls weren't as irrelevant alien creatures who only cared about inane trifles like hair toggles and glittery nail varnish, instead of vitally important things such as making balsa-wood aeroplanes and painting 1/72 scale model soldiers, but were in fact beautiful, terrifying alien creatures who never seemed to notice he was there. All of his life, he'd been pulling and heaving at a door that led into an enchanted garden, and quite suddenly he'd noticed that in fact it opened inwards, and all he had to do was push gently with the tips of his fingers. Would have been nice, he couldn't help thinking, if someone had told him about this, but maybe that was what Darwin had in mind when he talked about natural selection. After all, Paul reasoned, you wouldn't want idiots like him splashing about in the shallow end of the gene pool with their inflatable armbands and polystyrene floats. That said, he hadn't got a clue what he was supposed to do next. Presumably, at some point, he was going to have to say something toe-curlingly embarrassing, and if that went okay, there'd be kissing and, well, stuff like that. Obviously, he was all for that, just as he'd always really fancied owning a big yacht and sailing it single-handed to New Zealand. Now that he was at least part of the way along, he had the unpleasant feeling that his yacht was an open boat, and he was adrift in it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, he assured himself, after all, it couldn't be too difficult, could it? He considered his relatives, Uncle Trevor and Cousin Darren and Cousin Lorna's husband Eric, men with the personal charm of dustbins and just enough intelligence between the three of them to power a traffic light. And yet they'd all contrived to attract, woo, bed and marry females, often not in that order. If they could do it, so could a lawnmower or an answering machine or a tin opener or a small rock, and so by implication could he. In theory. "You've gone quiet," Sophie said. Paul looked up, startled. "Sorry," he said. "I was miles away." She was frowning at him slightly, and he remembered those occasions on which she'd appeared to have read his mind. He guessed this wasn't one of them, because she hadn't thrown the ham roll at him. I was just thinking," he said, "about those spreadsheets." "Oh." Maybe there was a tiny spark of disappointment in her voice. "What about them?" "Well, absolutely, what about them? That theory of yours about them trying to get rid of us. What we've been doing this morning seems very like what you were saying, giving us horrible pointless jobs to do so that we'll leave, and then they won't have to fire us." She shrugged. "I'm not so sure about that anymore," she said. "Like, now I come to think of it, it's just the sort of thing I've seen people doing in my dad's office. I mean, someone's got to do it, and the partners aren't going to muck about with scissors and sellotape." Paul scented a possible change of subject and pounced on it, gladly. "What did your dad do then?" he asked. "Oh, He's an accountant, she sighed. It's a family business. Him and Uncle Joe and Uncle Steve. He really wanted me to go into it, but I told him, no way. She made it sound like her father had been nagging away at her for years to join him in sailing down Niagara Falls in a barrel. Exactly why sorting spreadsheets and copying them for J.W.Wells was so much better than doing pretty much the same sort of thing for her father and uncles, he wasn't quite sure. But no doubt there was a reason. How about you? She went on, with a certain degree of effort. What's your father do? He used to be something to do with double glazing, Paul replied. But he retired early and he and Mum moved up to Florida. She nodded. You didn't fancy going with them? I wasn't asked. Ah, she frowned. My sister Fleur, she's 5 years older than me. She works for a bank, and they sent her to New York for a year. She really liked it over there. Mum and Dad say it's great there, he said. Nice hot weather and the people are very friendly. I'd like to go and visit them, he added. Some day, when I've saved up. Fleur's in Borneo at the moment, she said. After that, it'll probably be either Tokyo or Chile. Travelling around is one of the things that she likes most about her job. Paul decided he couldn't care less about her sister Fleur. Sounds pretty interesting, he said. Oh, most of the time it's just sitting behind a desk, talking on the phone, Sophie replied. And I don't think she's ever got time to go out and see things or stuff like that. Still, I guess it must be nice to know that you're in the same country as all the scenery and fascinating stuff, even if you never get around to doing anything about it before it's time to come home. It's like me, she added with a faint wry grin. A cousin of mine came up from the country to stay for a while, and she went off to see the Tower and St Paul's and the Planetarium and the London Eye and all that sort of thing. And a week later she'd done it all and went back to Norwich. I've lived here since I was 3, never been to any of them. I suppose I might get round to it someday, but it just goes to show you can be surrounded on all sides by loads of amazing stuff and never really know it was there. He had the feeling that she was telling him something, but he couldn't quite make out what it was. I went to the planetarium once, he said, with a school party. Can't say I liked it much. You had to lean right back in your seat to see what was going on, and I hurt my neck. There wasn't much anybody could say about that, and Sophie duly didn't say it. Paul had the feeling that things weren't going well. This was supposed to be the stage where you got to talking about things, family, childhood experiences and all that stuff, and you lost track of time, and eventually the waiters came and threw you out because they wanted to tidy up and go home. He was sure that was how it was supposed to be, and presumably Uncle Trevor and cousin-in-law Eric had been here and done this and got a passing grade at the very least, good enough to get them through into the next round. He tried to think of a perceptive observation about life, but nothing occurred to him. Eat your ham roll, she said. What? Your ham roll, she said. You haven't touched it. Oh, all right. He wasn't in the least bit hungry. Also, he had no illusions about what sort of spectacle he presented when consuming food. In fact, he'd always been deeply puzzled as to why so many dates, assassinations and encounters are traditionally structured around meals, because by no stretch of the imagination is eating an attractive spectacle, and even Gordon lads and lasses tend to sound like hotel plumbing when drinking soup. He nibbled self-consciously at the rock-hard raw, and was painfully aware of the crumbs that snored down his shirt front. "Did you bring an old pullover?" she asked. He nodded gratefully. "I don't know if he actually meant that seriously, or if it was just him being funny," he said. "But I thought I'd better not take any chances. What about you?" Her eyebrows tightened a little. "That's why I'm wearing this horrible scruffy old suit I bought for £6 in Oxfam shop," she replied. "Not that it bothers me at all. I hate having to wear all these stupid work clothes. My mum had to go out and get them for me. I haven't got a clue about all that stuff. Might as well be back at school, wearing uniform." Paul nodded. In the wild, he wore interchangeable jeans and anything he happened to find in the t-shirt drawer that passed the sniff test. Dressing up in suits struck him as a bizarre leftover from a previous century, while doing laundry and ironing shirts had come as a very nasty shock, as if he'd gone to the doctor's and been prescribed a course of leeches. "I'm still not sure exactly what it is we're supposed to be doing," he said. "For one thing, what's they need a strong room for? I thought it was just banks." She shook her head. "Lawyers and accountants too," she said.
My dad's office has got one. Well, they call it a strong room. It's actually a converted toilet with a Yale lock on the door. It's where they keep people's share certificates and bonds and stuff.
He thought for a moment. Maybe that's what J.W.Wells and Co. does, he speculated. Maybe they're just accountants after all.
I don't think so, she replied. I mean, I'm not an expert or anything, but it doesn't strike me as much like my dad's place. I think they're either stockbrokers or they do import-export. Or commodities, she added, whatever that involves. I think they buy up loads of stuff from one lot of companies and sell it to another lot of companies for more than they paid for it.
The book site, you mean?
Yeah, though really that wouldn't fit at all, would it? Maybe they're into mineral rights as well as minerals.
Paul frowned. He wasn't sure minerals had rights, though he couldn't see offhand why they shouldn't. He couldn't remember having seen mineral rights activists picketing steelworks on the telly or being stopped in the street and asked to sign petitions about it, but maybe the movement was still in its infancy. At 1:55, they went back to the office. The long stapler had, of course, vanished.
My turn, Sophie said. I'll go and look for it, and you can get on with the collating, all right?
He'd been working away steadily for something like a quarter of an hour, his mind very much on other matters, when the door opened and someone he recognised drifted in. A tall, thin, bald man with clumps of white hair over his ears that reminded Paul of snow on the mountains in the summer. "Mr. Carpenter," he said. He sounded annoyed and nervous. "I don't think we met since you came in for the interview. I am Theodorus Van Spee." He held out a long-fingered, liver-spotted hand with bitten fingernails. On its middle finger was a thin silver ring. Hello," Paul said awkwardly. Mr. Van Spee, only he liked to be called Professor, Paul remembered, might look frail, but he had a grip like a scrapyard car crusher. What can I do for you?" The Professor seemed to be looking over Paul's shoulder. "Oh, there's nothing at the moment," he said, in an accent that Paul reckoned was probably Dutch. "I was passing and thought I might as well introduce myself. Your colleague, Miss Pettingill, she's not here." She's looking for something," Paul said. "The stapler. We needed to staple up the, He stopped babbling. "She'll be back any minute," he said. Did you want—" The Professor's thin lips curved very slightly into the ghost of a smile. "No, there's nothing important. I simply wish to introduce myself to her also, not having encountered her since the interview. So," he went on, looking Paul straight in the eye and reminding him uncomfortably of several headmasters he'd known in his youth, "how are you settling in with us? Smoothly, I hope?" For some reason, Paul felt a sudden urge to tell this strange man the truth, the whole truth, including the bits about swords and stones, frozen pizzas, claw marks, and the Gilbert and Sullivan. In fact, it was only his instinctive terror of tall, thin authority figures that stopped him. Oh, fine," he said. "Excellent," said Professor Van Spee, frowning slightly. "No doubt, to begin with, everything seems a little strange, but that will quickly pass, I am sure." Once again he was staring over Paul's shoulder at the blank wall, as if he was expecting to see something there. "And no doubt it's easier, the two of you starting at the same time. Always it's easier when there are two, easier to learn the ropes together. It was so when I first started here. I began as a clerk, you see, just as you are now, but that was many years ago." Paul wanted to turn around and see just what was so fascinating about the wall, but he didn't. "Yes," he said, it's a great help." The Professor nodded absently. "And Miss Pettingill is a charming young lady," he said. "She has a birthmark just above her navel, and her pet rabbit was called Lucky, though he died 9 years ago. You should not buy her flowers, and that would be most inappropriate. But she has a weakness for Cadbury's cream eggs, although she is reluctant to admit it. She has no great interest in music, but you would do well to familiarize yourself with the works of Dickens, Turgenev, and Dick Francis, all of which," he added with a slight frown, "she reads for pleasure. Some knowledge of contemporary art would stand you in good stead, but guard against any temptation to show off. Better to avoid the topic completely. Cars bore her. She affects an enthusiasm for motorcycles, but this is only to annoy her parents. In reality, she does not care for them. Coca-Cola and fizz urine she detests, though she will eat hamburgers and pizza if she's hungry. Regularity of meals matters more to her than quantity or indeed quality, and often, when she is surly and short-tempered, it is only because she needs something to eat. She drinks beer ostentatiously so as to appear unfeminine, but does not like the taste. You should avoid any mention of Birmingham, lest it awaken old memories and may distress her. Rats don't trouble her. Snakes and spiders do. She is firmly convinced that she is not beautiful. To assure her otherwise would merely antagonize her. Compliments should therefore concern her intelligence, resourcefulness, and generosity of spirit. And should you choose to offer words of praise in respect of any of these, your remarks would be far from empty flattery. A small gnat whirred past the professor's left ear. He snapped it out of the air between thumb and middle finger without looking at it. Where money is concerned, she is prudent and scrupulous, almost to a fault. Be sure to repay what you borrow, though avoiding undue haste, and do not offer to pay for her in restaurant or places of entertainment. If you dine out together, take pains to remember what you ordered, so that the bill may be apportioned quickly and without dispute. She attended dancing lessons until she was 12. She claims to despise dancing, but secretly and guiltily enjoys it very much. You might care to seek basic instruction yourself, as she would not look kindly on your present shortcomings in this regard should dancing occur. As you have yourself perceived, she can to a certain extent discern from your face what you're thinking. Do not try and mask your thoughts, however. Rather give her credit for a laudable measure of understanding and compassion. When you buy her a present, I would suggest either a short wool scarf or a good quality pocket calculator. Above all, do not seek to impress or pretend to be other than you are, and under no circumstances should you kiss her shortly after you have consumed peppermint. He coughed, reached in his jacket pocket for a handkerchief, and carefully dabbed at the tip of his nose. "Excuse me," he said. "I am due in a meeting with my partners. The 5th page from the bottom in that pile is out of sequence. Please correct the error before they are stapled together." His brow clouded as though there was something he'd forgotten, and then it relaxed. "Have a nice day," he said, and left the room. Several seconds passed before Paul woke up out of the trance he'd been in since the professor had started talking. As soon as he came round, he checked the 5th page from the bottom. He stared at it for a while, then put it away where it belonged, 3rd from the top. "Finished?" He hadn't noticed her come back, and nearly jumped out of his skin. "Oh, almost," he said. "I found it," Sophie said, waving the stapler triumphantly. "God only knows how it ended up in the broom cupboard." She stopped and looked at the piles of copied spreadsheets. "Haven't you got any further than that?" she said. "You aren't even halfway through." "Sorry," he said awkwardly. "Only that old thin bloke with the little beard, Professor—" He paused, pretending he'd forgotten the name. "Professor Van Spee?" He nodded. "That's him. Anyhow, he stopped by. Only just left, in fact." He breathed in and looked away. "Do you know him from somewhere else?" "Me?" She shook her head. "Never set eyes on him before the interview. Why?" "Oh, nothing. He's not a friend of the family, anything like that?" "God, no. Why'd you ask?" Paul shook his head. "Nothing. That is, he said something that I thought might mean that he knew you from somewhere. But it must have just been me getting wrong into the stick." "Oh," she shrugged. "So what did you talk about?" "Oh, the usual stuff," Paul croaked. How are you settling in? I expect it's all very confusing to start with. That sort of thing." If she noticed anything odd about his tone of voice, she didn't comment on it. They finished the collating together, sorted the result into bundles, and stapled them up. "Right," Sophie said. "I'll take them up to Julie's office, and I'll meet you down in the strong room. I'll take the stapler too," she added. "I expect someone will come looking for it sooner or later, and then at least someone will know where it is." Paul went back to his office and picked up his sweater. He didn't put it on in case Mr. Tanner had been kidding after all, and somebody objected to him wearing tatty old clothes in the office. On the way back down to the basement, he tried very hard not to think about what Van Spee had told him, and failed miserably. The weirdness of it all certainly wasn't lost on him, but most of his thoughts led towards "does that mean she?" and veered hastily away. As he passed the waste paper basket in reception, he took a packet of extra strong mints out of his jacket pocket and dumped them. It was probably just as well that he was somewhat preoccupied, or his first sight of the strong room would have unnerved him completely. It struck him as a cross between an old-fashioned library and a maximum security prison, with a touch of the Mines of Moria thrown in for good measure. Mr. Tanner hadn't been fooling with him after all. The dust was deep on the shelves, and he devoutly hoped he wouldn't come across the spiders who'd spun the enormous cobwebs that sagged from the corners of the room like the sails of becalmed galleons. The air was thick enough to grease axles with. About 50 years ago, someone had started painting the ceiling battleship grey, but had given up halfway. Paul could understand why. Sophie wasn't impressed either. She arrived bearing 2 notebooks and 2 pencils, looked around and said,
"God, what a dump!"
It's pretty horrible," Paul agreed. "Did you manage to figure out exactly what we're supposed to be doing here? It all sounded a bit vague to me."
"Inventory,"
Sophie replied, looking about her with distaste.
"He wants a complete list of everything they've got in here and where it is. Plus, we've got to put it all in order so they can find it again."
"Bloody hell," Paul said. It was a large room, bigger by half again than his bedsit, and the shelves that lined all 4 walls were rammed with black tin boxes, files, folders, ledgers, and large, fat beige envelopes. "It'll take forever." She shrugged.
"That's what we've got to do," she said. "I vote we take it in turns. One of us looks in the boxes and files and stuff and calls out what's in there. The other one writes it down."
She paused, frowning.
"And we've got to figure out some way of archiving it all. What we need are lots of yellow stickies, so we can write a number on each one."
Paul nodded dumbly, still stunned by the magnitude of the task. "Yellow stickies," he repeated. "Where do we get them from?"
"Julie, I suppose," Sophie replied. "Like everything in this place apart from breathing air. I'll go and see to that. You look like you need to sit down already."
While she was away, Paul wandered around the room, picking things off the shelves and putting them back in a despairing manner. Among the things he picked up was a tall, wide book, handsomely bound in red leather. There wasn't anything written on the spine, but when he opened it, he realised that it was a list, an inventory of the things in the room. Unfortunately, it was very old and presumably out of date. It was written in spidery copperplate, and the ink had turned brown. As far as he was any judge of such things, it had to be at least 70 years old, possibly more. Still, he thought, it was bound to come in handy, though he wasn't quite sure how.
"Yellow stickies,"
Sophie said triumphantly, coming in with a shoebox-sized carton in her hands.
"Millions of them, and I didn't even have to sign for them. I asked, and she just handed them over without a word."
"Look at this," Paul interrupted, and showed her the book. She didn't seem impressed.
"Don't see how that's going to help," she said. "I mean, chances are there's been lots of new stuff put in here since this was done, and loads of stuff taken out as well."
She turned the pages slowly.
"Still," she went on, "it gives us an idea of what we're supposed to do. Look, there's columns for when each thing was deposited, where it was put, and each time they've been taken out, who took them, and when they were brought back. Seems a fairly sensible way of going about it," she said generously. "Look at some of these dates, though. They go back ever such a long way."
Paul looked. On the 2 pages open in front of him, the earliest date was 1857, and the most recent was 1941. 1 or 2 items had been crossed neatly through, to show that they had been handed back to their owners or otherwise disposed of. Not many, though. "And that's not all," he went on. "Over in that corner there's a stack of great big trunks, like old-fashioned luggage, and cases like musical instruments live in, and some tea chests, all sorts of things."
"Well,"
Sophie replied, turning the pages of the book,
"at least it might give us some idea of what they do here."
Paul nodded. "I guess so." He'd just noticed a glass case of stuffed birds on a high shelf, and next to it a mechanic's blue painted toolbox. Though it looks to me like this is a place people dump their old junk, he said. Though not lately, he added thoughtfully. Doesn't look like much of this stuff was put here recently. I mean, look at these envelopes full of papers. Sophie looked up.
They're old envelopes,
she said. Paul grinned. Did you ever collect stamps? No, me neither, but these have got to be pretty old. They've got King George and King Edward on them, and Queen Victoria. Worth a bob or two, for all I know. I wonder if anybody would miss them. Sophie scowled at him.
Don't you dare,
she said. He shrugged. Well, anyway, he said, there's not many with Queen Elizabeth on, and even those are pretty ancient. When did she come onto the throne? 1950-something? In fact, he added quietly, if there's anything here that's more recent than 50 years old, I haven't spotted it yet. Maybe that old book could be more use than we thought.
I don't think so,
Sophie answered.
We've still got to start from scratch. That's all there is to it.
She closed the book with a snap and put it on a shelf.
Come on, she said. We'll start here, by the door, and work our way round. You can do the writing down to start with, while I call out, okay?
Paul nodded and picked up a notebook and pencil, while Sophie broke open the box of yellow stickies.
I'll start at 1, she said.
All right, here goes. She took out the envelope at the front of the bottom shelf nearest the door and opened it.
Item 1, she said. Envelope of papers. No, don't bother writing that down. Share certificates, she announced. Let's see. 7, 8, 900 shares in Whitlow's Bank in the name of G.L. Mayer, whoever he is.
Was, she corrected herself.
This certificate's dated 1901, so presumably he's dead by now. Funny, she added. You're supposed to write and tell the company when a shareholder dies, and they send you a new certificate. I know that from helping out in Dad's office. It makes all sorts of problems with tax and stuff if you don't.
Paul wrinkled his nose. Maybe they're just old ones that never got chucked away, he said.
Well, someone ought to write and find out, she said. Whitlow's are still in business after all. These might be worth lots of money. Anyhow, not our problem.
She put the envelope back.
Item 2.
Hang on, Paul said. Pencil's broken.
Just as well I brought 2 then, Sophie sighed. You're probably pressing too hard. Ready?
Paul nodded. Item 2, he said.
All right. Item 2.
She opened the envelope and pulled out a ragged brown sheet of paper.
Looks like a map,
she said. Paul grinned. Don't tell me, he said. Pirate treasure. X marks the spot.
Not pirate treasure, Sophie said quietly. But you're not far off. King Solomon's mines.
Paul looked up. You what?
That's what it says here. Map of King Solomon's mines, in funny, squiggly handwriting. Looks like it was drawn with a bit of old stick or something. Smells horrible, she added. Anyhow, there isn't a name or anything. Hold on, she said. Maybe if we look in that book of yours, it'll be in there.
Could be. How'd that help? Sophie looked at him impatiently.
Because it might say who this belongs to or what it is. If we just put down map of King Solomon's mines, Mr. Tanner might think we're trying to be funny, and I really don't want to go through this lot and then get sent down here to do it all again properly.
Paul pulled a face. You're right, he said. Then he remembered what the professor had told him. That's very good thinking, he said. Just as well you thought of that, or we would have been in real trouble. She looked at him oddly.
Yes, well, she said. Now, where's it got to? Right, here we are. Is there anything written on the envelope? According to this, there should be a number or something.
Paul checked. Yes, he said. Here you go. A/572. Does that help?
Hang on.
Sophie riffled through the book.
Got it, yes. A572 treasure map.
Bloody hell.
Treasure map, she repeated. Property of Sir Henry Curtis, deposited 1878. Taken out, can't read the date, 18-something, and there's another date for when it was put back. Can't make that out either. Anyhow, you can put down map property of Sir Henry Curtis. How's that sound?
Absolutely fine, Paul said, with a trifle more enthusiasm than the suggestion warranted. He remembered other parts of the professor's lecture and added, Yep, that ought to do, I guess.
So glad you approve, Sophie said. Item 3. You ready, or am I going too fast for you?
No, that's fine. Item 3.
Item 3 turned out to be a thick bundle of letters bound up in blue ribbon, all addressed to the Honourable A. Poindexter, Esquire, Ploverley, Hants. Sophie didn't open them. Item 4 was a small cardboard box containing a little glass jar with some green powder in it. Fortunately, there was a label on it with a number, and with the help of the book, they were able to record it as Chemical Sample, Dr. A. Jekyll, Harley Street, London. Item 5 wasn't in the red book, so they had to do the best they could. It went in their notebook as Scrap of Paper in Unidentified Language. That lot good, that'll do anybody, Sophie muttered. Still, what's this? Right, item 6, another one without a number on it. Fuck!
Paul looked up. What? He asked.
Well,
Sophie said in a very small voice.
If it's what I think it is, here, you have a look.
Paul looked at it over her shoulder. It's a manuscript, he said. Handwritten. Can't read the... Hold on, it's not even in English.
No,
Sophie said.
That's French. Le Jardin du Diable. The Devil's Garden. Un roman de Marcel Proust, she scowled. Proust didn't write a novel called The Devil's Garden. At least not that I heard of.
Who's Marcel Proust? Sophie clicked her tongue.
Just write it down, she said. Shit, they've got some weird stuff down here. No wonder they keep it locked away. I wonder who it belongs to.
Item 7, by contrast, was a contract for the sale and delivery of 60 tons of dried prunes, dated 1907, though it wasn't numbered or mentioned in the red book. Item 8 was an ancient theatre programme, The Second Mrs. Tanqueray, dated 1890-something, and with the name Billings pencilled in the front cover. The red book listed it and confirmed that in 1927 it belonged to Henrietta Billings of Kensington, but had no further light to shed on the matter. Item 9 was a column of figures with 6 undecipherable signatures at the bottom and a small rusty key. It was annotated with the number B998, which led them to a red book entry that said, Schedule of Anticipated Returns and Key, S. Majors & Co., 1899. Item 10 was a plain white envelope containing 5 desiccated cherry stones. No red book number. Item 11 was a dozen years' worth of early Edwardian tailor's bills made out to one Jeremy Castle of Ilkley, Yorks. Item 12 was a single small tooth, no name or number.
Right,
Sophie said, closing number 11's envelope and putting it back with a slight shudder.
You take over here and I'll do the writing. I've had enough. Some of this stuff is sick.
She wasn't far wrong at that. Item 19 proved to be a dried-up animal's paw with skin like parchment, large claws and a few strands of molting brown fur on the back. Apparently, one Celia Garvin had thought enough of it to want it kept safe in 1919, but Paul couldn't bring himself to share her enthusiasm. Not all the items were as gruesome as that. Number 22 was a pencil sketch of some trees done on the back of an envelope addressed to a French bloke called R. Matisse. Sophie got quite excited about that. 25 turned out to be a tad under $250,000 in Confederate banknotes, while 26 was a cutting from a 1930s newspaper advertising someone or other's patent bicycle seats. 29 harked back to the macabre theme, an envelope stuffed with hair and nail clippings, but Paul couldn't see a name or a red book number anywhere. It was item 32 that suddenly turned them both silent and thoughtful, looking at each other with the proverbial wildsome eyes. Again, no name or reference number in the earlier catalogue, but Paul had no trouble at all knowing what to put down in the property of column. It was an old photograph, sepiaed and cracked along a fold, with the name of a West End photographer printed in white along the bottom, and the date 1891. The man in the photo was dressed in a top hat and frock coat, and he was holding a black lacquered walking stick and a pair of white cotton gloves. But it was unmistakably Professor Van Spee.